Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. All over the world today, we're witnessing the rise of religious fundamentalism. In the United States, it's the Christian right. In Baghdad, it's Shia fundamentalism. And in Nigeria, it's the war between the Christian fundamentalists and the Muslim fundamentalists. In every case, it's ordinary people who are suffering from religious fanaticism. With me to discuss how we respond to this rise of fundamentalism is Joan Smith, novelist and columnist. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you.
I'd just like to start by asking you to give us perhaps some examples of how religious fundamentalism is impacting on people's lives.
Well, it's not just the examples you mentioned. Also, we're seeing women journalists in Palestine being threatened that if they don't cover up and wear the hijab on television news, that they're being threatened with violence. Obviously, something like that is, an even worse set of circumstances going on in Afghanistan. And of course, you're right, it's not the province of any one particular religion. But I think what you're seeing overall is an attempt by clerics and religious authorities, many of them are self-appointed, to put themselves back at the heart of authority. And my view has always been that one of the defining characteristics of the modern state is that religious morality has to slug it out with all the other kinds of morality. And what we're seeing now is the attempt to impose a strict religious morality in many, many more countries than one would have expected at this point in history. And inevitably that has an impact on ordinary people, particularly women, and particularly people whose sexuality isn't approved of.
I mean, do you think it definitely is getting worse, or is it just that this is more drawn to our attention now?
No, I think it's definitely getting worse. And I was born in London, I grew up in this country. When I was a child, when I was a teenager, even early in my 20s in this country, it was actually possible to know people for quite a long time without even knowing whether they had a religion or what it was. Religion didn't have the presence in public space that we see now. And certainly in this country, we've seen, I think, an incredible intrusion into public space of religion. And I think some of that has been led by a militant form of Islam. But I think that the Christian churches, particularly the Catholic Church, and its recent pronouncements on subjects like abortion and sexuality, I think that those Christian churches, which have been slightly on the back foot for the last 30 years, I think they're taking confidence from the success of some of these other religions like Islam.
Yeah, it does seem that Pope Benedict is adopting a much more aggressive and forthright, stance on a range of moral issues. And we also, of course, have seen it recently in Israel, where Jewish fundamentalists have recently successfully got through the Knesset yes. a legislation to allow local authorities there to ban gay pride marches. Yes. So it does seem to be, different fundamentalisms are feeding off each other and I think to a similar goal in different ways.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and I think the goal is social control. If you go back to the period before the Enlightenment, the church really was the other authority along with the state, usually a monarchy of some description. But the church had enormous control over people's lives. The Christian church I'm talking about in Western Europe. Obviously in other parts of the world it would be different forms of religious authority. Since the Enlightenment we've pushed that back. And I think one of the successes that we had, and I'm speaking as somebody who's completely secular here, is in insisting that religious morality is not the only morality that exists. It's not the only one that's valid. And indeed, I've spent my entire life arguing a kind of a morality based on the idea of universal human rights and saying this is actually better than the traditional morality that religions promulgate, which is usually excessively interested in people's sex lives, I have to say. What's interesting about Pope Benedict is that I don't think he's doing very well. A few weeks ago, the legislators in Mexico City, which is one of the biggest cities in the world, decided they wanted to legalize abortion in the first trimester. And this is a huge move in Latin America, where hundreds of thousands of women have illegal abortions every year. And the Vatican's response was to say, if you put this through, we will excommunicate you. and it was voted for. It went through successfully in the Mexico City legislature. Pope Benedict arrived in Brazil, and as he got off the plane, appeared to suggest that he had now excommunicated everyone who'd voted for the bill, and his aides then had to run around saying that he was tired and he hadn't quite meant that. But the lesson of history is that the Vatican doesn't do all that well when it interferes in people's lives in this way.
I mean, you've said that, but of course, as we know, they have a long history of interfering in people's lives. I mean,
yes.
Think of all the liberation theology priests in Latin America who were expelled and excommunicated
yes.
because they dared to stand on the side of the poor against the dictatorships which were backed by the Vatican.
And I think that one of the problems with how we push this back, get religion out of our private lives again, is that there is a kind of misunderstanding of what's going on for the very reasons that you're outlining, which is that a lot of people will say, but surely the Catholic Church, for example, is the friend of the poor in Latin America. The Church stands up for the poor and the dispossessed, forgetting, of course, that the Church also stood up for General Pinochet. And the Pope of the time actually very famously appeared on a balcony with General Pinochet, even though we all knew what terrible, terrible things had happened under that regime. And so I think there is a tendency, and it happens on the left too, to be a bit sentimental about the Church and not to understand that the impulse towards charity can coexist quite easily with the impulse towards tremendous social control.
Yes, when Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador stood out against the dictatorship and on the side of the poor and the oppressed, he got very little help and support from the Vatican. He was basically left alone, and of course he was murdered by the regime and its henchmen, and barely a murmur of protest from the Vatican over that, because he was regarded as a troublesome priest,
Yes.
not the right type of Catholic.
Yes, yes, that's right. And I think, looking elsewhere in the world, you can see it's very depressing and very clear that the impulse behind these new fundamentalisms is to restore that control. And it's not about kind of the religion being the friend of the poor. I mean, certainly the kind of horrible, horrible violence we're seeing in Iraq at the moment is largely between the Sunni and the Shia. And it's a historic conflict which goes back over 1,000 years. But the people who are suffering under that are ordinary people who are being blown apart in car bombs. But also, the women TV presenters who are being shot dead, kidnapped and shot dead for refusing to cover up. And then what you get in this country is a kind of misguided argument that if women want to wear this kind of modest dress, what skin is it off your nose? And I've spent enough of my life arguing against that kind of imposition of notions of purity on women to understand that, of course, it's skin off my nose, because once you set up the ideal of the pure woman who's modestly dressed, then the rest of us are all whatever they want to call us, and we're the women who can be raped. So it does have an impact on the rest of us.
Yeah, I think it also reminds me of the whole history of the struggle against the foot binding of women in China. So many women there agreed to it,
yes.
and felt it was a right, appropriate thing, that it was a symbol of their modesty, their femininity, and so on. And they colluded with it.
Yes.
But I think we all now recognise that, that was an horrendous misogynistic practice,
yes.
which was, again, all about controlling women, in this case, binding their feet so they could barely move to keep them under control.
Yes, and I was in Egypt earlier this year, and I was very shocked by the fact that almost all women are now wearing the veil. And Egypt was really the first country in which women took the veil off. And there's a very famous incident in the 1920s when an Egyptian feminist called Huda Sharawi arrived back from a feminist conference at Cairo railway station. She was met by her supporters and she ripped off her veil. And within 10 or 15 years, most women, apart from rural areas of Egypt, were not wearing it. Now they're wearing it again. Now they're not wearing it because there's a sudden outbreak of piety or they've decided they don't like fashion. They're wearing it because of the influence of the Muslim Brothers, which is an Islamist organization. And what happens is that women feel if they don't go along with that, they get singled out, they get threatened, but also, no one then wants to marry a woman who isn't pious. And so you can see that it's when people say they're not threatened into it, there's more than one way of forcing somebody to do something against their will. It doesn't have to be just overt threats.
Yeah, it's social pressure. Now, I know from friends of mine who live in East London in the Bengali community, they tell me these are young women who say that they don't really want to wear the veil, but they feel obliged to because otherwise they get name-called and abuse from men in the street, as well, of course, from male members of their own family who regard them as impure and brazen and so on. So it is, in their own testimony to me, it's all about family and community pressure, not a genuine choice.
Yes, and there's a very brilliant French organisation called Ni Put Ni Soumise, which you probably know about, which grew up in the Parisian suburbs, and that was started by young women, mostly from the Maghreb. Their families were from the Maghreb, and it means neither whores nor submissive. And what they were doing was they were protesting both against the discrimination they faced as women from North Africa, of North African descent in France, but also against the control that was being imposed on them by their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, being pushed into marriages they didn't want, being beaten by their brothers if they wore jeans. And in fact, they have produced a terrific little booklet for girls from that community, explaining, what you can put up with and what you don't have to put up with. And if you are being forced into doing things, behaving in a way that you feel uncomfortable about, these are people who can help you. So it's not just that this critique is coming from outside, because that's something that people often argue, that that we are Western white liberals and we're imposing our values. Actually, when you look at what's happening around the world, particularly to women, which is one of my interests, you find that the great struggle around the world isn't the fight to wear the hijab or the niqab, it's the fight not to wear it. And I actually find it a bit self-indulgent here that there are women in this country making a great fuss about their right to wear these things, which are, for most women in the world, a symbol of male domination.
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at overall at this rise of religious fundamentalism, you made a very good point that you are a secularist. And I am too. I mean, I would like to see a secular Britain. I'd like to see the disestablishment of the Church of England, so that it isn't the official state religion, and so that it's only so that it's not that only a member of that faith can be our head of state.
Yes.
But I think even from a religious point of view, secularism is in the interests of people of faith, because it guarantees that no one faith oppresses and dominates another.
I think that's incredibly important to say, particularly in the Labour Party at the moment, because I noticed that quite recently one of the candidates for the deputy leadership, John Cruddas, attacked secularists in the Labour Party and talked about intolerant secularism. And I think that's a terrible misunderstanding of what secularism is. And I think the folly of Christian bishops and archbishops who take confidence from the Muslim revival here and think that, we'll get aggressive about our religion. What they don't realise is that they're entering a very, very tough contest. And what you end up with is, these religions don't easily coexist at all, except in a secular society where religion is kept in the private sphere, and publicly we believe in democracy and human rights and so on. And human rights, any kind of belief in universal rights, includes the right to believe in a religion and to manifest your religion, as long as you're not actually breaking the law or oppressing other people. So secularism actually protects religions, because otherwise I think that history shows that anywhere you have aggressive forms of religion coexisting, they get into a kind of civil war, and the fallout from those kind of religious civil wars are what we're seeing in Iraq at the moment.
Yeah, I think certainly in Iraq, a secular state would be the interests of both Shia and Sunni, as well as, of course, Yazidis and Christians and others. I don't know whether you know that some weeks ago I wrote a piece for the Guardian Commenters Free site about Sheikh Qakwani, who is an Iranian Shia theologian, the son of a very famous Grand Ayatollah, and he has argued very strongly, as a Shia Muslim, that secularism is the best defense for people of faith. And he's very strongly criticized the Iranian regime because he says that by incorporating a particular interpretation of Shia Islam as the state religion and giving clerics this power, it means that not only other branches of Islam, like Sunni, are excluded, but even dissidents within Shia are excluded and persecuted. And indeed his father was murdered we almost certainly by the Iranian regime, because he spoke out against this particular interpretation of Islam that Ayatollah Khomeini and others were pursuing. So secularism does seem to be, to me, a very strong and powerful and valuable defence against religious persecution.
Well, I think so, and I think, you know, for a very long time the sort of dominant current in Islam was Sufism, and of course Sufis are not, the way they manifest their religion isn't political in the way that, say, the Wahhabi sect is, or the Iranian Shia persuasion is, and so they were able to sort of follow their religion and get on with it, and get on with other people as well. What's happened, I think, is I think it's a reaction to what's happened in the Middle East, but I think people misunderstand what it's a reaction to. I think after centuries of dictatorship and corruption, particularly in countries like Egypt, I always think Egypt is one of the absolutely key countries in this. And, you know, the United States gives an enormous amount of money to Egypt every year. It's second only after what it gives to Israel. And it gets very little back in terms of democracy building, persuading Mubarak to build a proper civil society. And I, you know, wearing my kind of human rights hat, which is the other thing that I do, it's always been clear to me that if you don't allow democracy and civil society and a vibrant oppositional culture, what you get is something much worse, because you get the other kinds of opposition, the illegitimate forms of opposition, which are violent and extremist. And, you know, you can see that happening in Gaza today, I'm afraid.
What do you put down as the reasons why we're seeing this rise of religious fundamentalism? Why is it happening now?
I think it is. It's the historic failure. I don't want to start a history lesson. I think going back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the Second World War, instead of that region developing economically and developing in terms of its politics, what you got was a series of client states of the West and kingdoms and theocratic states like Saudi Arabia. And they all repressed people's human rights. They repressed people's legitimate desire to take part in the societies they live in. I mean, a country like Saudi Arabia, you know, there is no civil society. There are no trade unions. There's very little way for even young people to mix with people of the opposite sex and so on. And in those circumstances, the only focus of opposition becomes the religion. And, you know, I think something similar. You know, you could make a similar analysis with Iraq, that Saddam's regime was so brutal and so vile, and he killed so many people, he forced so many people into exile, and there were no mechanisms of civil society. There was simply the Ba'ath Party and the army. And when the invasion happened, and, you know, personally, I think getting rid of Saddam is quite a good idea, but not in the way it was done, because it was obviously going to leave a vacuum. And what's rushed into that vacuum is precisely the kind of religious fundamentalism we're talking about.
I mean, it does, looking, say, for example, at Palestine now, it seems to me an absolute tragedy that we had once, many years ago, a secular
yes.
and broadly democratic Palestine Liberation Organization
yes.
that, you know, did not seek to impose religious values, but now we have the rise of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups
yes.
who are hell-bent on a very, very harsh Islamist-style regime in Gaza and indeed the West Bank, if they can get away with it.
Yes, and I think that's a very good example of what I'm saying, that, you know, the failure of an attempt at democratic secular politics to get justice for the Palestinians has unfortunately resulted in the rise of organizations like Hamas, whose fundamentalism is absolutely ghastly. You know, they're talking about, last year they were talking about banning things like belly dancers. You know, that you can, it's so wearisome that you know what they're going to go after. They're going to go after women, they're going to go after gay people, all of that. And I think there is an element there too of when people feel out of control of their lives, which they do in dictatorships and in conflict situations like Palestine, what they do is they try to impose control on other people to shore up their egos. And I think that's very much what it's about. So I guess that takes us on to the question of how you actually counter it. And it seems to me that economic development is actually key to it. And in Turkey, which is a very interesting example of a flawed but secular Islamic society, Muslim society, Ataturk's view when he founded the secular republic was that the role that religion had played in the empire was actually a brake on the country's economic and political development. And I know there are problems about Turkey's possible accession to the EU, but at least, you know, he was foresighted enough to create something where, in the last few weeks, hundreds of thousands of people have been out on the streets to defend the secular state. And it's not impossible that they could join the EU, and I think that's a very important example. What we need is something like that in Egypt. Certainly need it in countries like Iran, where there's a huge, very young, very educated population. I think those countries become a powder keg because people have aspirations which are so repressed. But Palestine is a very good example. It seems to me that what Israel should be doing with its neighbours, with Lebanon, with Palestine, and so on, is actually doing democracy. Leaving aside the question of the occupied territories, it ought to be pouring money into its neighbours' economies to educate, to bring up the standard of living. Because once you do that and people start feeling comfortable, then fundamentalism loses its attraction.
Mm. Yeah, I think that the Israelis have been particularly short-sighted and particularly closed-minded about solutions. And you've mentioned, of course, the rise of fundamentalism in the Palestinian territories. Let's not forget the fundamentalism of the Jewish Orthodox settlers, yes. Who are just as fanatical and hateful and potentially violent, and whose presence in those territories, of course, inflames the situation. So it's like a clash of two fundamentalisms, the Judaist yes. and the Islamist. Yes. And together, out of that you cannot get a solution.
And you can argue that that is partly a result of Israel's intransigence towards its neighbours, because you've had quite big emigration from Israel in recent decades, back to Europe, back to the United States. And the people who are left tend to be the more orthodox and fundamentalist Jews from countries like Russia, the Ashkenazis. And they, unlike the Sephardis, they haven't lived in that part of the world for a very long time. And I think that's where that fundamentalism comes from. That's absolutely right. But what struck me very much about the conflict with Lebanon last year was how crazy, how wrong it was, but also how crazy it was, because it achieved precisely the opposite of what was intended, i.e. it strengthened Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, Lebanon is a country I know and I've written about. And what you see there is how smart Hezbollah have been in presenting themselves as a green, environmentally aware organisation, which is actually not as fundamentalist on the question of women as a lot of others. And they present themselves as quite a modern movement and a nationalist movement. And where to the outside world, it's very obvious they're Islamist, and they are. People within Lebanon last year, actually, people outside the Shia community started supporting Hezbollah because of what Israel did. And, a friend of mine went back to her flat in Beirut just after the conflict ended. All the windows were blown out. Within half an hour, there's a bang on the door. She opens it. Hello, we're from Hezbollah. We've come to glaze your windows. So they do kind of grassroots politics like the Green Party, or more like the Lib Dems, actually. I think Hezbollah are like the Lib Dems with an armed wing. And that's very dangerous. Mm. But you don't defeat that militarily. You defeat it politically and economically. And that was Israel's great mistake.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely hit a really strong point. Economic development is the key.
Yes.
And if in the Middle East, Israel and indeed, the international community really funded economic development to
yes.
end the mass unemployment, the yes. lack of schools and hospitals, built the social infrastructure, this would do so much to undermine the fundamentalists
yes.
and give a space in which civil society could flourish, and in which, of course, democratic political movements could take root.
I think that's right. I think, people like you and me, we can argue with fundamentalists and we can stand up to them and we can say they're wrong and we can have that kind of argument. But what you've got to do is provide something else, provide an alternative. And it seems to me also in this country that, where we're undoubtedly seeing not a huge number, but a worrying number of particularly young men being attracted to Islamist ideas, is that you have to make sure that economic development is actually even across the country and that you don't have pockets of poverty and unemployment which allow those ideas to flourish. So I think fighting those ideas politically is very important, and fighting them in terms of human rights, but also I think economic development is absolutely the key.
Okay, Joan, well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the discussion, and it sounds like, from your point of view, that we need a new Enlightenment. Thank you. I hope you'll all join us next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.